"Your seat is over there," my fiancé said, pointing past the ballroom doors toward a single folding chair beside the catering station, and for a second I honestly thought he was joking. Then his sister Claire laughed into her champagne glass and said, "Honestly, Camila, this setup probably suits you better anyway." People turned to look at me. Not just one or two. Entire tables, men in tuxedos, women in silk gowns. Board members from Mercer Biotech staring while my future mother-in-law adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and smiled like this humiliation had been planned down to the inch. Ethan leaned closer to me and lowered his voice just enough to make it worse. "Please don't make this difficult tonight," he whispered. "This event actually matters." I felt something cold settle in my chest then. Not anger, not even sadness yet. Just that strange numbness that happens when someone you love embarrasses you so publicly that your body almost refuses to believe it's real. The ballroom lights reflected off hundreds of crystal glasses, throwing little white sparks across the marble walls, while a jazz trio played near the stage, like nothing unusual was happening. Around me, people pretended not to stare while absolutely staring. I looked at the chair again, metal legs, black cushion, sitting beside stacked catering trays and extra linen napkins, like I was overflow seating at my own fiancé's company gala. "You don't have a table for me?" I asked quietly. Ethan exhaled hard through his nose like I was exhausting him already. "Camila, not tonight." Claire crossed her arms. "The guest list was carefully curated. This isn't exactly your world." I swallowed once and nodded because I had learned over the last 4 years that arguing with the Mercer family only made them crueler. The more calm you stayed, the more they pushed. "Of course," I said softly. "I understand." Ethan immediately relaxed when I didn't fight back. That hurt more than the chair. He expected me to accept humiliation quietly because I always had. If this story truly resonates with you, or if you've ever been underestimated by people who never bothered to know your real value, gently press like and subscribe, only if this story speaks to your heart. And before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. I always read the comments late at night when the world gets quiet. My name is Camila Reyes. I'm 34 years old, and this was the night my fiancé publicly called me useless before discovering the one truth his entire family had hidden for years. But to understand why I stayed silent that night, you need to understand what the Mercer family thought I was, and what I actually was. 2 hours before the gala started, I had stood in the penthouse bathroom fastening pearl earrings while Ethan adjusted his cufflinks behind me. "Try not to overdo it with the makeup," he'd said casually while checking himself in the mirror. "My mother already thinks you try too hard sometimes." I remember staring at my own reflection after he said it. Cream-colored dress, hair pinned back low against my neck, minimal jewelry. I had spent almost 40 minutes trying to look elegant without looking intimidating, because Ethan's family treated confidence in women like some kind of social disease. "You look beautiful," I said quietly to him instead. He smiled immediately then. Ethan always softened when attention returned to him. "Thank you, babe." He kissed my forehead and added, "Tonight's important. There are people at this gala who can completely change my future at Mercer." I almost laughed at that. Almost. Instead, I smoothed invisible wrinkles from my dress and asked, "Are you nervous?" "A little," he admitted. "My department head review is coming up next quarter. If everything goes right tonight, I could finally move into senior operations." I nodded slowly while watching him in the mirror. Ethan had no idea I already knew the board approved his promotion 3 weeks earlier. No idea the paperwork had crossed my desk before it crossed anyone else's. No idea the only reason his department still existed after last year's restructuring was because I stopped the board from cutting it entirely. He thought promotions happened because people liked him, because he worked hard, because his last name opened doors. He never realized someone had quietly been holding those doors open the entire time. "You'll do great tonight," I told him. "I always do," he replied with a grin. That confidence used to charm me. Back when we first met at a charity fundraiser in downtown Chicago, Ethan seemed ambitious in a refreshing way. Driven, focused, different from the loud men constantly trying to impress everyone in the room. He used to bring me coffee during my late work nights. Used to ask questions about my day even when he barely understood my answers. But somewhere along the way, his family started shaping him into someone smaller, colder, more performative. Margaret Mercer especially. She treated status like oxygen. Every conversation became a subtle ranking system. Watches, schools, zip codes, job titles. The first time I met her, she looked at my simple black heels and asked, "Comfort over presentation?" with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Over time, the comments became quieter but more personal. "You're lucky Ethan likes uncomplicated women. You're sweet, even if business discussions clearly bore you. Strong personalities can threaten successful men." The strange thing was, none of them actually knew anything about me. Not really. The Mercers assumed I worked some vague consulting job because I let them assume it. Ethan once asked why I never corrected people when they underestimated me. I told him it wasn't important. The truth was more complicated. 5 years earlier, Mercer Biotech had been collapsing quietly behind polished press releases and staged investor confidence. Their debt ratio was catastrophic. Their acquisition strategy had failed. Banks were preparing exit contingencies. And then my grandfather died and left me something nobody expected, a trust large enough to save the company outright. I was 29 years old when Mercer's legal team sat across from me in a Manhattan conference room asking for help. I remember the rain hitting the windows while attorneys slid paperwork across polished oak tables. In exchange, one of them explained carefully, you would receive controlling silent shares. 52%. Enough ownership to control the company entirely without publicly becoming its face. I accepted because at the time, I believed in Ethan, believed in his father, believed the Mercer Company could still become something meaningful. But the agreement came with one condition from Margaret herself. No public ownership disclosures unless legally necessary, she had said smoothly. The market responds better when leadership appears stable within the family. Translation: they didn't want investors discovering the company's controlling shareholder was a Latina woman in her 20s, so I stayed invisible. At first, it felt strategic. Then it became habit. Then somehow it became my entire life. A waiter interrupted my thoughts at the gala by offering champagne. "For the guests inside only," Claire said before I could even reach for a glass. The waiter looked embarrassed and quickly walked away. Ethan didn't correct her, didn't even look at me. He was too busy laughing beside regional directors who suddenly mattered more than basic human decency. I stared down at my hands, folded quietly in my lap, while silverware clinked against china inside the ballroom. Then my phone vibrated once. One message: board counsel has arrived. Final signatures required before midnight. I locked the screen immediately when Ethan glanced over. "Who keeps texting you?" he asked. "Work." "Still?" Claire smirked. "Whatever little consulting thing she does never stops." Ethan chuckled softly. "Camila likes feeling busy." Something about the way he said it cracked open a part of me I had spent years trying to protect, not because he mocked me, but because he genuinely believed I was small. And the terrifying part was realizing I had helped create that illusion myself. Then the ballroom doors opened again, and I heard one of the board attorneys say quietly, "Has anyone located Miss Reyes yet?" My stomach tightened instantly because the tone in his voice told me something had changed, something none of them were prepared for. The attorney's voice carried across the ballroom softly, but I saw the immediate reaction ripple through the executives nearest the stage. Heads turned, glasses paused halfway to lips. One of the older board members checked his watch, while another whispered something sharp into his assistant's ear. Ethan noticed it too. "What is going on?" he muttered beside me, irritation replacing confidence for the first time that night. Claire rolled her eyes. "Probably another investor issue." But I already knew it was bigger than that. The legal team never sounded nervous unless money was involved. Large money. The kind that moved entire companies overnight. I lowered my gaze to my lap before anyone could study my face too closely. That had become instinct years ago. Hide reactions. Stay calm. Stay smaller than the room expects you to be. I learned that long before I met Ethan Mercer. I learned it growing up in a tiny 2-bedroom apartment above my grandfather's old pharmacy in San Antonio, where silence was often the safest thing a woman could own. My mother used to say, "People listen differently when a girl sounds too confident." She would brush my hair at the kitchen table while the ceiling fan rattled overhead and repeat it like survival advice instead of sadness. My father left when I was 8 years old. One suitcase, one argument behind a closed bedroom door, then gone. After that, my mother worked double shifts at the county hospital, while my grandfather practically raised me between pharmacy shelves that smelled like rubbing alcohol and peppermint gum. He believed in quiet discipline, quiet intelligence, quiet money. Never show people everything you have, he told me once while balancing invoices at the counter. The world gets uncomfortable when women hold power openly. At 10 years old, I thought he was being dramatic. At 34, sitting outside a ballroom while my fiancé treated me like decoration he forgot to polish, I realized he had been preparing me for people exactly like the Mercers. When I was 12, my school held a citywide business competition. Teams built mock companies and pitched them to local investors. I spent 3 weeks creating a detailed proposal for a pharmaceutical supply tracking system after watching inventory problems at my grandfather's pharmacy. I still remember standing in the gymnasium holding my presentation board, while one of the judges looked directly past me and asked my male partner, "So son, which part did you handle?" My partner answered honestly, "Actually, Camila did almost all of it." The judge laughed softly. "Sure she did." That night, I came home furious. I slammed my binder onto the pharmacy counter and told my grandfather I never wanted to compete again. He looked up from his bookkeeping glasses and asked calmly, "Did you lose?" "No," I snapped. "We won." "Then why are you angry?" I remember the exact sound of rain tapping the windows while he waited for my answer. "Because nobody believed I was the smart one," I whispered finally. My grandfather nodded once like he had expected that answer all along. "Good," he said. "Let them underestimate you. It gives you room to move." Back then, I hated hearing that. It sounded too much like surrender. I did not understand that he was teaching me strategy. Years later, when Mercer Biotech nearly collapsed under hidden debt and reckless expansion, that same strategy became the reason I survived rooms full of men who thought I was invisible. Ethan never understood any of this because he grew up in a completely different world. The Mercer family lived inside a 14,000 square foot lakefront home outside Chicago, where every dinner felt like a performance review, crystal serving bowls, perfect posture, conversations that sounded polite, until you listened closely enough to hear the judgment hidden underneath. The first Christmas I spent with them, Margaret Mercer handed me a cashmere sweater and said, "Neutral colors will suit you better than bright tones. Softer women age more gracefully." I thanked her because I did not know what else to do. Claire once asked me during brunch, "Do women in your industry ever settle down properly?" As if ambition and love could not exist inside the same person. Ethan never corrected them. That part mattered most. Not the comments themselves, the silence afterward. Small silences repeated over years become entire relationships. About a year into our engagement, Margaret invited me shopping on Michigan Avenue before a charity gala. We stopped inside a jewelry store where diamonds glittered beneath soft white lights. She pointed toward a delicate bracelet and said, "This feels more like you," elegant but understated. Then she gestured toward a much larger emerald necklace nearby and smiled faintly. "Claire could carry something like that. She has the personality for statement pieces." I laughed politely while the saleswoman shifted awkwardly beside us. Later that afternoon, Margaret looked over my shoulder while I answered an email in the car. "Still doing consulting?" she asked casually. "Yes." "That must be nice. Flexible little projects. Ethan needs someone calm supporting him at home." Supporting him at home. Meanwhile, I had spent the entire morning reviewing a 78-page merger analysis involving 3 pharmaceutical distributors across the Midwest. But after years of being misunderstood, correcting people started to feel exhausting. Easier to let them keep their version of me. Easier to become smaller than constantly defending your actual size. Back in the ballroom hallway, another text appeared on my phone. "Urgent. Board cannot proceed without you." Ethan noticed my screen light up again. "Seriously, who keeps contacting you?" His tone sharpened this time. "You have been distracted all night." I slid the phone into my clutch. "It is work-related." Claire laughed softly beside him. "Camila talks about work like she is running the Pentagon." Ethan smirked tiredly. "Trust me, if she were important, my mother would know about it." Something inside me flinched when he said that, not because it was cruel, because he believed it completely. Then the ballroom doors opened wider, and I saw 2 members of the legal team walking quickly toward the hallway with expressions that looked far too tense for a routine shareholder meeting. One of them stopped abruptly the moment he saw me sitting beside the catering station. His entire face changed. Relief, confusion, panic. "Miss Reyes," he said carefully, almost breathless. "There you are." And for the first time all night, Ethan looked at me like he realized there might be something about me he had never actually understood. The attorney's expression shifted so quickly it made the air around us feel different. One second he looked stressed, the next he looked relieved enough to breathe again. "We have been trying to reach you for 20 minutes, he said quietly. Ethan straightened beside me, confused and suddenly alert. "You know Camila?" The attorney blinked once like the question itself surprised him. "Of course I know Miss Reyes." His tone changed carefully after that, more formal now. "The board is waiting upstairs." Upstairs, not inside the ballroom, not at the gala tables covered in white orchids and gold candles. Upstairs, where the executive conference suites overlooked the Chicago skyline through 40-foot windows, Ethan gave a short, awkward laugh. "There must be some misunderstanding." The attorney did not even look at him. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Mercer." Then he turned back toward me. "The revised acquisition documents arrived 15 minutes ago. We cannot proceed without your authorization." I felt Claire staring at me hard enough to burn through skin. "Acquisition?" she repeated slowly. "Camila, what is he talking about?" I stood carefully, smoothing the front of my dress while every instinct in my body told me this moment had finally arrived. The dangerous thing about hiding your real life from people is that eventually the truth shows up all at once. And when it does, nobody knows where to stand anymore. Ethan stepped closer to me. "Camila?" His voice sounded smaller suddenly, less certain. "Why would the board need you?" I opened my mouth to answer, but another memory surfaced before the words could come out. 5 years earlier. New York City. 36th floor conference room. Rain streaking across glass while Mercer Biotech executives sat around a table pretending they were not desperate. I remember Ethan's father looking 10 years older that day. Robert Mercer had loosened his tie and rubbed his hands together while financial projections glowed red across the presentation screens. "If this leaks publicly," one executive warned, "the stock collapses within 48 hours. Another added quietly, 3 lenders already signaled withdrawal risk. That was the day I realized how fragile powerful people actually are. They spend years looking untouchable while balancing their entire lives on debt, appearances, and other people's silence. Robert looked directly at me across the table. "You understand what this company means to our family." I remember folding my hands carefully before answering. "I understand exactly what it means. At 29 years old, I already managed private investment structures most people twice my age struggled to understand. My grandfather had prepared me long before he died. While other kids spent summers at camps, I spent mine inside conference rooms, listening to negotiations about land rights, pharmaceutical distribution, and long-term equity holdings. By 16, I could read corporate balance sheets faster than most accountants. By 24, I had already doubled the value of my inheritance portfolio quietly enough that almost nobody outside our attorneys knew. But wealth does strange things to relationships. The moment people know you have money, they stop hearing your actual voice. Everything becomes strategy to them. Motive, threat, opportunity. So I learned to keep ownership invisible whenever possible. Robert Mercer slid a folder toward me that day in Manhattan. 52% controlling shares, he said carefully. Silent ownership, full legal authority, the company survives immediately. "And publicly?" I asked. Margaret answered before anyone else could. "Publicly, leadership remains with the Mercer family. Stability matters to investors. Stability. Such a clean word for fear. I should have walked away then. Maybe everything after that would have hurt less. But Ethan and I were still new back then, still soft with each other. He used to bring me coffee at midnight when I worked late. Used to touch the small of my back while guiding me through crowded rooms. Used to ask me questions like my answers mattered. I truly believed we were building something together, so I signed. And overnight, Mercer Biotech survived because of money nobody knew belonged to me. Back in the ballroom hallway, Claire crossed her arms tighter. "This is ridiculous." She looked directly at the attorney now. "Camila does consulting work. She is not involved with corporate acquisitions." The attorney hesitated. That hesitation told me he already understood something dangerous about the Mercer family. They genuinely did not know who I was. Ethan laughed once under his breath, but there was panic behind it now. "Camila, seriously, what is happening?" I looked at him carefully. The silver light from the ballroom chandeliers reflected against his tuxedo collar, while confusion slowly replaced confidence in his face. For the first time since I met him, Ethan Mercer looked like a man standing outside his own life. "You should go back inside," I said softly. "The gala is about to start." "Do not do that," he snapped quietly. "Do not suddenly become mysterious." Claire stepped forward beside him. "If this is some kind of stunt—" "Claire," the attorney's voice cut across hers firmly enough that even she stopped speaking. "With respect, this matter is confidential." That sentence changed everything. I watched realization flicker across Ethan's face piece by piece. Confidential. Board authorization, acquisition documents, legal counsel. None of those things belonged anywhere near the version of me he thought existed. He stared at me differently now, trying to recalculate years of assumptions in real time. "Camila," he said slowly, "what exactly do you do?" Such a simple question. One he should have asked years ago. Before the comments. Before the chair outside the ballroom. Before allowing his family to reduce me into someone small enough to embarrass publicly. But the truth was, Ethan never asked because he never thought he needed to. People who believe they already understand your worth rarely look deeper. I slipped my phone from my clutch as another message appeared across the screen. Board vote moved up. All principal shareholders required immediately. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. That always happened when major decisions approached. Calm first, emotion later. My grandfather used to call it executive stillness, the ability to remain emotionally level while entire rooms panicked around you. Ethan saw the message reflected briefly across my screen before I locked it again. Principal shareholders. His face lost color so fast it almost frightened me. "No," he whispered automatically. "That is not possible." But deep down, I think part of him already knew, because suddenly the last 4 years looked different. The late-night calls, the confidential travel, the private meetings I never explained. The reason board members occasionally recognized me at company events before quickly pretending they had not. Claire shook her head sharply. "Ethan, she is bluffing." But before either of us could answer, the ballroom lights dimmed slightly and the giant projection screens near the stage flickered on. Then the opening slide for the emergency shareholder session appeared above the crowd downstairs. And right beneath the Mercer Biotech logo, my full legal name appeared across the screen for everyone to see. For one long second, nobody in the ballroom moved. The massive projection screen above the stage glowed against the dark ceiling, while my name sat there in sharp white letters beside the Mercer Biotech logo like a truth nobody could push back into hiding. Camilla Ray's principal shareholder authorization required. I heard the soft clink of someone setting down a champagne glass too hard. Somewhere near the front tables, a woman whispered, "Who?" Ethan stared at the screen, then at me, then back again like his brain refused to connect the two versions of reality standing in front of him. Claire actually laughed once under her breath, nervous and brittle. "This has to be a mistake." But nobody from legal corrected it. Nobody from the board looked confused. In fact, several executives had already stood up from their tables. One of them, a silver-haired investor named Howard Levin, walked directly toward me with his hand extended. "Miss Reyes," he said warmly, "we have been waiting for you. Waiting for me, not Ethan, not Robert Mercer, me." The silence inside the ballroom changed after that. It was no longer judgmental. It was stunned. Ethan's mother rose slowly from her chair near the front of the room, one manicured hand tightening around the stem of her wine glass. Margaret Mercer rarely looked surprised. Her entire personality was built around control. But right then, standing beneath crystal chandeliers while board members acknowledged me publicly for the first time in years, she looked genuinely shaken. "Camila," she said carefully, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." Privately. The word almost made me smile. For 4 years, everything about me had been kept private whenever it benefited them. My ownership, my investments, my role inside the company, private when the business needed saving, invisible when appearances mattered. Ethan stepped closer to me fast enough that his shoulder brushed my arm. "Tell me this is not what it looks like." His voice had dropped low now, desperate enough that almost nobody else could hear it. I looked at him quietly. "What does it look like to you? You own part of the company?" he whispered. "Part." Even now he could not imagine the real number. Claire folded her arms tightly beside him. "This is insane. She does not even work there. Howard Levin glanced at her with visible confusion. Miss Reyes has attended board reviews for years. Claire's face drained instantly. Ethan blinked hard. Board reviews? He repeated. No, Claire said immediately. No, that is impossible. Ethan would know. But that was the problem. Ethan never asked enough questions to know me. The legal counsel stepped beside us, holding a dark blue folder against his chest. Miss Reyes, we really do need your signature upstairs. Upstairs, again that word. And suddenly I saw the entire night differently. The folding chair outside the ballroom, the missing seat assignment, the jokes, the way Ethan casually reduced me in front of executives who technically answered to decisions I made behind closed doors. He had not just humiliated me publicly, he had humiliated the majority shareholder of his own company while believing everyone would agree with him. The humiliation burned differently now, colder, sharper, not because they underestimated me, but because they had trained each other to believe the lie so completely. Margaret stepped toward me carefully, lowering her voice. Camila, sweetheart, there are investors here tonight. We should avoid unnecessary confusion. Sweetheart. She had not called me that in over a year. Confusion? I asked softly. You mean the part where your family spent years pretending I was insignificant? Her expression hardened immediately. There it was, the real Margaret. Controlled warmth disappearing the moment obedience failed. Nobody said insignificant. Ethan rubbed a hand across his face. Can somebody please explain what is happening? His voice cracked slightly on the last word. For the first time since I met him, Ethan sounded afraid. Not angry, afraid. Robert Mercer finally appeared from near the stage then, moving through the crowd with the tense expression of a man watching decades of careful image management collapse in real time. Camila, he said sharply once he reached us. We need to speak upstairs now. I held his gaze. Do we? His jaw tightened. This is not the place. Interesting, I said quietly, because apparently the hallway outside the ballroom was the perfect place to humiliate me 15 minutes ago. Ethan turned toward his father immediately. Dad, what is she talking about? Robert did not answer him right away. That silence said enough. Ethan looked between all of us now, like he had stepped into the middle of a conversation everyone else started years ago. You knew? He asked his father slowly. You knew about this? Margaret stepped in quickly before Robert could answer. Ethan, this situation is more complicated than you understand. Then help me understand, he snapped. Several nearby executives pretended not to listen, while very obviously listening. I watched realization hit Ethan piece by piece. The hidden board meetings, the unexplained investor dinners I attended alone, the confidential calls I took outside rooms, the way certain executives always recognized me before correcting themselves publicly. Every strange moment he ignored was suddenly rearranging itself into something undeniable. Claire shook her head hard. No, absolutely not. There is no way she owns more of this company than our family does. Nobody answered her. That was the moment the floor disappeared beneath her too. Because silence inside wealthy families usually means yes. Ethan stared directly at me now. How much? He asked quietly. I did not answer immediately. The legal counsel did it for me. 2% controlling interest, he said, held through Reyes Capital Holdings since the emergency stabilization agreement 5 years ago. I watched the exact second Ethan's entire understanding of our relationship shattered. His breathing changed first, then his posture, then the color drained slowly from his face until even Claire reached for his arm. No, he whispered again. That is not possible. Robert closed his eyes briefly like a man exhausted by consequences finally arriving. It is possible, he said heavily, because without Camila, this company would not exist anymore. The room went completely silent after that. Every lie collapsed at once, every joke, every cruel little comment, every dinner where they treated me like decoration, instead of the person quietly protecting everything beneath them. Ethan looked at me now like he did not know where to place his own memories anymore. You let me believe, he started weakly. I interrupted softly. No, Ethan. You chose what was easier to believe. Then the ballroom screens changed again. A new document appeared across every display in the room. Emergency board restructuring session, effective immediately. And beneath it, one line changed everything forever. Departmental Leadership Review, Ethan Mercer. The room did not erupt the way people imagine moments like that do. Nobody screamed. Nobody dropped glasses dramatically. Real humiliation is quieter than television teaches you. It sounds like sudden silence. Like expensive shoes shifting awkwardly across marble floors, while people avoid eye contact because they realize they witnessed something deeply personal collapse in public. Ethan stared at the projection screen for several long seconds before finally looking back at me. "Leadership review?" he repeated slowly. "Why is my department under review?" Nobody answered immediately. Robert Mercer loosened his jaw once before speaking in the careful tone wealthy men use when they are trying to control damage already spreading too fast. There were concerns raised during restructuring discussions. Ethan frowned hard. "What concerns?" Robert glanced at me briefly. That was enough. Ethan saw it too. "No," he said immediately, stepping back from all of us. "No, Camila would not do that." The truth hurt in ways he still did not understand. Because I had done the opposite. 6 months earlier, Mercer Biotech's operations division had nearly been cut after a disastrous quarterly review. Ethan never knew his department lost almost $12 million through delayed manufacturing contracts because executives shielded upper management from blame. During the emergency board session, several investors argued for immediate restructuring. One board member actually said, "The operations division is emotionally managed, not strategically managed." Another recommended replacing Ethan entirely with outside leadership. I remember sitting quietly at the far end of the conference table while financial projections glowed across the wall screens. The room smelled faintly like burnt coffee and printer toner because everyone had been there since before sunrise. "If we eliminate the department now," I said calmly, "distribution timelines collapse within 2 quarters. Howard Levin looked at me carefully. "You are recommending we keep Mercer in position?" "I'm recommending we stabilize before we amputate." Robert Mercer stared at me that morning with something dangerously close to gratitude. Ethan never knew any of this. Never knew the promotion he celebrated. Weeks later only existed because I blocked the recommendation to remove him entirely. And now all of that history sat silently between us inside the ballroom while executives pretended not to stare. Claire folded her arms tighter. "This is unbelievable." Her voice sounded thinner now, less confident. "Camila, why would you hide this?" I looked at her quietly. "Would any of you have treated me differently if you knew?" Nobody answered. That silence became its own confession. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face slowly before turning back toward me. 4 years, he whispered. 4 years together, and you never told me." I almost laughed then, but it would have sounded too sad. "You never asked." His eyes closed briefly after I said it, because deep down, he knew it was true. Ethan spent years telling me about his promotions, his frustrations, his goals, his office politics. Meanwhile, he almost never asked what happened during my workdays beyond casual questions he barely listened to the answers for. Looking back, I think he liked loving a version of me that required nothing from him except approval. The moment the ballroom screens went dark again, conversations exploded quietly around the room. Executives moved toward private corners with phones already pressed to their ears. Investors whispered urgently. Someone near the back asked, "How did nobody know?" Another voice answered, "Apparently, legal kept it sealed through Reyes Capital." I suddenly felt exhausted, not angry anymore, just tired in a deep way that reached all the way into my bones. The legal counsel stepped toward me again carefully. "Miss Reyes, we really should continue upstairs." I nodded once. Ethan caught my wrist before I could move, not hard, just enough to stop me. "Please," he said quietly, "do not walk away right now." The softness in his voice almost made this harder. Almost. "You already asked me to sit outside tonight," I said gently. "I think we are past pretending this relationship was built on respect." His face changed after that. Not defensive, broken. Margaret immediately stepped between us like instinct took over before emotion could. "Camila, emotions are high right now. Nobody intended—" "You assigned me a folding chair beside catering trays," I interrupted softly. "Let us not rewrite the evening while it is still happening." She went silent. Robert exhaled heavily. Enough. That single word carried decades of authority behind it. The room quieted again. "This conversation does not continue publicly," he said firmly. "But the problem with humiliation is that once people witness it, privacy no longer exists." The story had already escaped the room. By midnight, financial blogs would be discussing the emergency shareholder meeting. By morning, executives across Chicago would know Ethan Mercer publicly embarrassed the controlling shareholder of his own company at a gala event. The irony would travel faster than facts. I left the ballroom 20 minutes later through a private elevator with legal counsel and 2 board members beside me. Nobody stopped me this time. Nobody questioned where I belonged. But the second the elevator doors closed, my phone started vibrating continuously inside my clutch. Ethan. Ethan again. Claire. Margaret. Ethan. Voicemail after voicemail appearing across the screen faster than I could clear them. I listened to the first message while staring at the elevator numbers changing slowly overhead. "Camila, please answer," Ethan said breathlessly. "There has to be some explanation for why you hid this from me." Then another message arrived before the first even finished playing. "I am sorry about tonight. I did not know." Another. "Please just talk to me before this gets worse." By the time I reached the executive floor, there were already 12 missed calls waiting. Around 2 in the morning, after the restructuring session finally ended, I sat alone in the backseat of my car overlooking Lake Michigan while cold rain tapped softly against the windows. Chicago looked blurred and silver outside. My engagement ring rested in my palm under the dashboard lights. Ethan sent an email at 2:17 a.m. The subject line simply read, "Please let me explain." Then another at 2:41. Then another just after 3:00. Long paragraphs, apologies, confusion, excuses wrapped carefully inside regret. At 4:12 a.m., Margaret sent a message too. Families should not fall apart over misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. I stared at that word for a long time. Then I looked down at the folding chair still burned into my memory like something physical. The chair outside the ballroom. The place they truly believed I belonged. And for the first time in years, I finally understood something painful about love. You cannot spend years shrinking yourself for people and then act surprised when they forget your real size. By sunrise, my phone battery had almost died from notifications. But inside the silence of that parked car, with the city waking slowly around me, I had never felt more emotionally alone in my entire life. 3 days after the gala, I stopped answering my phone completely. Not because the calls slowed down, because they did not. Ethan called 31 times the first day alone. By the second day, he started leaving voicemails that sounded less polished and more frightened. "Camila, please. Just let me explain. I know I hurt you. Please do not throw us away over one terrible night." One terrible night. That was the strange thing about emotional humiliation. People only count the moment they can see. They do not count the years that built toward it quietly underneath. I stayed inside my apartment overlooking Lakeshore Drive, with the curtains half closed while cold November rain drifted against the windows in soft gray streaks. The place suddenly felt unfamiliar, without Ethan's things scattered around it. No shoes near the kitchen island. No expensive cologne lingering after showers. No low voice talking during late-night conference calls from the other room. Silence has texture when someone leaves your life emotionally before they leave physically. It settles into corners, into empty coffee mugs, into the untouched side of the bed. By Friday morning, Ethan started emailing instead of calling. The first few messages were long enough to scroll for minutes. He apologized repeatedly, explained repeatedly, defended himself repeatedly. I read every word once while sitting barefoot at my kitchen counter with cold coffee beside me. "Camila, I never knew your role because you never let me in. Camila, my family influences me more than I realized. Camila, I have spent days replaying everything and I hate who I was that night. The problem was, I believed he meant every word. That made it worse somehow. Cruelty delivered intentionally can at least be categorized cleanly. But Ethan genuinely loved me while slowly reducing me at the same time. That contradiction sat inside my chest like broken glass. Around noon, there was a knock at my apartment door. I already knew who it was before opening it. Margaret Mercer stood in the hallway holding a cream-colored envelope with both hands. She looked older than she had a week earlier, not physically, emotionally. "May I come in?" she asked softly. I considered saying no. Instead, I stepped aside silently. Margaret walked through the apartment slowly, taking in details she had probably never noticed before. The framed black and white photos from my grandfather's pharmacy. The bookshelves lined with legal journals and investment texts. The quiet luxury she once dismissed as simplicity because she assumed real wealth always needed to announce itself loudly. "This place is beautiful," she said finally. I almost smiled at that. Ethan had lived there nearly 3 years, and his mother was only now really seeing it. She sat carefully at the kitchen island and slid the envelope toward me. "Robert wanted me to give you this personally." Inside was a handwritten letter from Ethan's father. The paper smelled faintly like cigar smoke and expensive stationery. "Camila, I failed you." Those were the first 3 words. He wrote about the company, about fear, about protecting investor confidence after the financial collapse years earlier, about how keeping my ownership hidden became easier over time because the family benefited from it. Then came the line that hurt most. "We allowed Ethan to believe a version of you that was convenient for all of us." Convenient. Such a small word for something so ugly. Margaret watched me read silently. "Robert blames himself," she said quietly. "He should," I answered without looking up. Her face tightened slightly, but she nodded. "You are right." The honesty surprised me enough that I finally met her eyes. For a moment, she looked less like Margaret Mercer and more like an exhausted mother watching her family fracture in slow motion. "Ethan has barely slept," she admitted softly. "He keeps saying he cannot understand how he missed who you really were." I folded the letter carefully. "Because nobody in your family wanted to know me," I said. "You wanted someone easier." Margaret lowered her gaze to the marble countertop. "Perhaps we did." The apartment stayed quiet after that, except for rain tapping lightly against the windows. Finally, she whispered, "Do you still love him?" I hated that question because the answer came too quickly. "Yes." My voice cracked slightly on the word. "That is why this hurts." Margaret looked genuinely sad then. Not manipulative, not strategic, just sad. "I do not think Ethan understood how much damage small humiliations can do over time," she said. "No," I replied quietly, "because they were never happening to him." After she left, I stood alone in the hallway for several minutes staring at the closed door. Then I slid slowly to the floor with my back against the wall and cried for the first time since the gala. Not loudly, not dramatically, just silently enough that even the city outside kept moving without noticing. I cried because I missed the version of Ethan from years earlier, the version who brought me coffee during long nights, the version who once drove 3 hours during a snowstorm because I casually mentioned feeling sick over the phone, the version who used to look proud standing beside me before his family taught him status mattered more than kindness. That night, I wandered into my office, unable to sleep, and opened an old storage box I had not touched in years. Inside were photographs from before Mercer Biotech, before boardrooms, before ownership agreements. There was one picture of my grandfather standing outside the pharmacy holding my shoulders while I smiled beside him at 16 years old. On the back, in his uneven handwriting, he had written, "Never become smaller just because someone else needs to feel bigger." I sat there for a long time holding that photograph while the city lights flickered softly across the windows. Then my phone buzzed once more. Not Ethan this time. Howard Levin. "We need to discuss the board transition. There are developments regarding Ethan's department you should know before Monday morning." I stared at the message while something cold settled slowly into my stomach. Because deep down I realized the gala had not destroyed everything yet. The real collapse was only beginning. Monday morning arrived cold and sharp over Chicago, the kind of gray November morning where the lake looked almost metallic beneath the clouds. I parked 3 levels below Mercer Biotech headquarters just before 7 and sat in the car for an extra minute with both hands resting on the steering wheel. My reflection in the windshield looked older than it had a week earlier. Not physically, just clearer somehow, less willing to disappear. When I stepped into the executive lobby upstairs, conversations shifted immediately. Not loudly, quietly. Heads turned, assistants straightened posture. People who had barely acknowledged me at previous company events suddenly held eye contact too long. The strange thing about power is that people only respect it once. They can see proof attached to it. "Good morning, Miss Reyes," the receptionist said quickly, standing before I even reached the desk. I nodded politely and continued toward the private elevators reserved for executive leadership and board members. 5 years of ownership, hundreds of strategic meetings, millions invested. Yet this was the first morning the building truly looked at me like I belonged there. Howard Levin was already waiting inside the conference room upstairs when I arrived. The city skyline stretched behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows washed pale silver by the weather outside. "You look tired," he said gently. I set my coat across the back of a chair. It has been a long week. Howard studied me carefully for a moment before sliding a folder across the table. The board completed its review of operations late Sunday night. I opened the folder slowly. Ethan's department performance reports, internal audit summaries, cost analysis projections. My stomach tightened as I flipped through page after page. This should have been caught months ago, I said quietly. Howard nodded once. Several executives shielded the numbers to protect Mercer family leadership optics. Of course they did. Appearance before accountability. That had always been the Mercer way. What happens now? I asked. Howard exhaled slowly. Officially? Ethan will likely lose his promotion track. I stared down at the papers without speaking. Unofficially, Howard added carefully, some board members are asking whether personal relationships compromised executive oversight. There it was, the part I had been dreading. You think they are blaming me. I think they are looking for someone to blame. Silence settled between us while heating vents hummed softly overhead. I closed the folder carefully. I will not let this become personal retaliation. Howard's expression softened slightly. That is exactly why half this board trusts you more than the Mercers now. Trust. I was still trying to figure out whether that word comforted me or exhausted me. By noon, I had already sat through 2 restructuring meetings, 1 investor call, and a legal review regarding pending acquisition approvals. Work helped. Numbers stayed logical even when people did not. Financial projections made sense. Emotional betrayal rarely did. Around 1:30, my assistant knocked lightly on the office door. There is someone here asking to see you. I looked up from my laptop. Who? She hesitated. Mr. Mercer. Ethan stood near the windows when I stepped into the private reception area outside my office. No expensive suit today, no polished confidence. Just a charcoal sweater beneath a dark coat, and exhaustion carved beneath his eyes like he had not slept properly in days. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he said quietly, I almost did not recognize you walking through this building earlier. I crossed my arms loosely. That makes 2 of us. The corner of his mouth twitched painfully like he wanted to smile but no longer trusted himself to try. Can we talk? I considered saying no. Instead, I motioned toward the smaller conference room beside my office. Ethan sat across from me at the long walnut table while soft rain streaked the windows outside. He looked around slowly before speaking. This was your office the whole time? One of them. He lowered his gaze briefly. God. There was no anger left in him anymore. Just disorientation. I spent years talking to you about this company, like you were outside of it. You never thought to ask why I knew so much about your quarterly reviews? I asked gently. He shook his head once, ashamed enough that I almost looked away. I thought you were interested because you loved me. That sentence hurt because it was true. I had loved him, deeply enough to sit through years of small humiliations while convincing myself they were not fatal. Ethan rubbed both hands together slowly before speaking again. My promotion is gone, is it? Probably. He nodded like he already knew. I deserve that. I studied him carefully then. The old Ethan would have defended himself first, blamed circumstances, blamed pressure, blamed his family. But grief changes people sometimes. Public shame does too. Why did you really come here? I asked softly. His eyes finally met mine. Because I realized something awful after the gala. His voice lowered. I spent years loving the version of you that made me feel important. The honesty landed harder than excuses would have. Ethan swallowed once before continuing. And the second I realized how much larger your world actually was, I understood how small I had treated you. Neither of us spoke for several seconds after that. Outside the windows, downtown traffic crawled through wet streets while helicopters drifted low above the skyline. Chicago kept moving no matter how badly individual lives cracked open inside it. I cannot fix this, Ethan said eventually. I know that now. He stood slowly from the table. But for what it is worth, I am finally starting to understand who you are. I watched him leave without stopping him. And strangely, for the first time since the gala, I did not feel devastated afterward. Sad, yes, but not destroyed. Because something inside me had started rebuilding quietly beneath the grief. That evening, long after most executives left for the night, I stood alone in my office reviewing final projections for the company acquisition. The city glowed golden white below the windows while my reflection stared back at me across the dark glass. My phone buzzed once on the desk beside me. Howard Levin again. Congratulations. The board approved your transition proposal unanimously. I stared at the message for a long moment before opening the attached document. Then my eyes landed on the final line near the bottom of the page. Effective January 1st. Kamala Ray's Executive Chairwoman, Mercer Biotech Holdings. January arrived wrapped in snow and silence. Chicago looked softer after heavy snowfall, like the city had finally decided to stop pretending it was not tired. On the first Monday morning of the new year, I stood alone in the executive dressing area beside the board conference floor, adjusting the cuffs of a charcoal blazer while sunlight reflected pale silver across the frozen lake outside. Someone had placed my new identification badge neatly inside a black velvet box on the marble counter. Kamala Ray's Executive Chairwoman, Mercer Biotech Holdings. The lettering was simple, clean, no dramatic gold trim, no oversized title. Still, I stared at it longer than I expected to. Because for years I had hidden behind silence so completely that seeing my name attached openly to power felt almost unfamiliar. My assistant Elena knocked softly before stepping inside. "The board is ready whenever you are," I nodded once. "Thank you." She hesitated near the doorway with a small smile. "For what it is worth, people are excited." I looked at her through the mirror. "About what exactly?" "About someone competent finally taking control." Then she left before I could answer. The hallway outside the executive wing smelled faintly like coffee and fresh paper. Analysts moved quickly between conference rooms carrying tablets and financial reports, while television screens mounted along the walls displayed early market updates. 6 months earlier, nobody in this building looked twice when I walked through these halls. Now, conversations lowered when I passed. Not from fear exactly, more from awareness. Respect changes the temperature of a room. As I approached the main boardroom doors, Howard Levin fell into step beside me, holding a stack of acquisition summaries under one arm. "You nervous?" he asked quietly. I considered lying. "A little." Howard smiled faintly. "Good. People who stop feeling nervous around power usually become dangerous." Inside the boardroom, 20-foot windows overlooked downtown Chicago, while snow drifted slowly between skyscrapers outside. Every seat around the long walnut conference table was already occupied. Investors, senior legal counsel, executive leadership. Men who once spoke around me instead of to me now stood as I entered the room. The movement happened almost instantly. Chairs shifting backward, jackets straightened, conversations stopping mid-sentence. "Good morning, Miss Reyes." Several voices greeted at once. The sound still felt strange. I moved toward the head chair at the end of the table slowly, fingertips brushing the polished wood surface for just a second before sitting down. Robert Mercer sat 3 seats to my right, looking older than I remembered from only a few months earlier. Retirement negotiations had begun quietly after the gala. Publicly, he framed it as succession planning. Privately, I think he was simply tired. "Congratulations," he said carefully once everyone settled. "You earned this." I held his gaze for a moment before nodding politely. "Thank you." It was the first honest conversation we had shared in years. The meeting began immediately after that. Acquisition approvals, department restructuring, manufacturing timelines, investor concerns regarding international expansion. The work itself grounded me. Numbers always had. Unlike people, financial systems usually revealed exactly what they were trying to do if you studied them long enough. Halfway through the meeting, one of the senior operations directors began presenting revised leadership recommendations for Ethan's division. His voice tightened slightly while speaking. "Following recent internal reviews, we recommend temporary supervisory oversight until departmental performance stabilizes." Temporary oversight, corporate language for lost trust. I kept my expression neutral while scanning the report in front of me. Ethan's name appeared 6 times across the restructuring proposal. None of it felt satisfying anymore. That surprised me most. I had imagined this moment differently after the gala. Imagined anger would taste sharper, more victorious. Instead, I mostly felt sad for the version of Ethan who could have stood beside me in this room if pride and insecurity had not hollowed him out slowly over time. "Miss Reyes?" Howard's voice interrupted my thoughts gently. "Do you approve the recommendation?" Every eye around the table shifted toward me. This was the moment now. The real one. Not the ballroom reveal, not the shareholder documents. This. The quiet decision nobody outside the company would ever fully understand. I closed the folder carefully. "No," I said calmly. Several executives looked surprised immediately. I am authorizing mentorship oversight, not demotion. The operations director blinked. You are retaining Mercer in leadership? I am retaining institutional continuity while correcting structural failures, I answered evenly. People improve faster when humiliation is removed from the process. Silence settled briefly around the table after that. Robert Mercer looked down at his hands. Howard gave the smallest nod beside me, like he understood exactly what I was doing. Not revenge, not rescue either. Something steadier than both. The meeting ended just after noon. As executives filtered slowly from the room, several stopped to congratulate me personally. One investor shook my hand firmly and said, "Your grandfather would be proud." That nearly undid me more than anything else that day. Later that afternoon, I walked through the lower executive floors reviewing department transitions with senior staff. Employees who once barely noticed me now stood straighter during presentations. Questions came directly to me. Decisions waited for my approval. In one conference room, a young analyst apologized nervously after stumbling through part of a financial summary. "Sorry," she said quickly, cheeks flushed. "I am still new." I remembered being 24 years old, sitting in rooms where men twice my age dismissed my voice before hearing it fully. "Take your time," I told her gently. "Confidence comes after repetition." She smiled with visible relief. Small moments like that stayed with me longer than board votes ever did. Around 5:30, I finally stepped into the private elevator leading toward executive parking. The building had grown quieter as snow darkened the windows outside. My reflection stared back at me again in the mirrored elevator walls. Same dark hair, same calm expression, same woman who once sat outside a ballroom beside catering trays while people laughed softly behind champagne glasses. But something fundamental had shifted underneath. Not because of the title, not because of the office, because for the first time in years, I was no longer asking permission to occupy space fully. The elevator doors opened slowly into the underground garage. And standing beside my car waiting quietly with his hands inside the pockets of a dark winter coat was Ethan. For a moment, neither of us moved in the underground garage. Snowmelt dripped slowly from exposed pipes overhead, while fluorescent lights hummed softly against the concrete ceiling. Ethan stood beside my car with both hands buried deep inside his coat pockets, like he was trying to keep himself together physically. He looked thinner than he had a month earlier. His shoulders carried exhaustion differently now. Less arrogance, more weight. I stopped a few feet away from him, my heels echoing faintly across the empty garage floor. "You should not be down here," I said quietly. Ethan nodded once. Probably not. His breath fogged lightly in the cold air between us. For several seconds, he just looked at me without speaking, almost like he was still adjusting to the reality of seeing me walk out of executive meetings instead of waiting quietly beside them. "You changed the board recommendation today," he said finally, straight to it. "No small talk." "Howard talks too much," I answered. A tired smile almost touched his face before disappearing again. "You could have removed me completely." "Yes." He lowered his eyes briefly. "Why did you not?" That question stayed suspended between us, while a black sedan rolled slowly through the garage several rows away. I reached into my bag for my gloves before answering, "Because humiliation is not leadership." Ethan looked down at the concrete floor after that. The silence stretched long enough that I almost walked around him toward my car. Then he spoke again, quieter this time. I keep replaying that night in my head. I froze slightly. Of course he did. So did I. The ballroom lights, the folding chair, Claire laughing softly behind her champagne glass. The exact tone in Ethan's voice when he said, "Please do not make this difficult tonight. Some moments do not fade. They settle permanently somewhere under your ribs. I know apologizing is not enough anymore," he continued carefully, "but I need you to understand something." I looked at him without answering. Ethan swallowed once before speaking again. I genuinely did not realize how cruel I had become. Cruel. Hearing him use the actual word mattered more than I expected. Most people soften what they did after causing damage. They say misunderstanding, miscommunication, mistake. Ethan finally called it what it was. "My family taught me to measure people constantly," he said quietly. "Status, connections, influence, and somewhere along the way I started doing it to you too." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. I wrapped my coat tighter against the cold. You did not just do it to me, I replied softly. You let them do it too. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. I know. Another silence settled between us. Slower this time. Heavy enough that even the distant elevator bell echoing across the garage sounded sharp. Claire still thinks this is all temporary, he admitted after a moment. She thinks eventually things will go back to normal. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny. Because it was exactly the kind of thing Claire would believe. And your mother? I asked. Ethan hesitated. My mother has not known what to say since the gala. That surprised me less than it should have. Margaret Mercer spent her entire life controlling social dynamics with precision, but once public perception shifted, she lost the one thing she trusted most: certainty. Ethan looked up at me again carefully. My father told me something yesterday. I waited silently. He said the worst mistake our family ever made was assuming kindness meant weakness. The words landed somewhere deep inside me because they sounded exactly like something my grandfather would have understood immediately. Two families. Two entirely different definitions of power. Snow blew faintly against the garage entrance, several floors away while cold air drifted through the concrete structure. Chicago winters always made conversations feel more honest somehow, like the weather stripped unnecessary performance away from people. How is your mother? Ethan asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard enough that I blinked. She is fine. Does she know everything now? I nodded slowly. Most of it. I had visited San Antonio 2 weekends earlier after the board transition finalized. My mother cried quietly at the kitchen table when I told her about the gala, not dramatic tears, the kind older women cry when something painful confirms fears they have carried for years. I worried this family would make you disappear, she whispered while wrapping both hands around a coffee mug. I just did not realize you were helping them do it. That sentence stayed with me afterward, because it was true. Nobody can shrink your identity completely without your participation eventually. Ethan stepped slightly closer now, though still careful not to invade the space between us. Camila, he said softly, do you think there is any version of this where you ever forgive me? I looked at him for a long moment before answering honestly. I do not know yet. His face tightened slightly, but he nodded like he expected nothing else. Then his phone started vibrating inside his coat pocket. He glanced at the screen and frowned immediately. It is Claire. You should answer it. Not right now. The phone kept vibrating. Again. Something about his expression shifted after the fourth call. Tension. Confusion. That is strange, he muttered quietly. What? Claire never calls repeatedly, unless something is wrong, he answered on the fifth attempt. Claire? I watched his face change almost instantly, while cold air drifted through the garage around us. Slow down, he said sharply. What happened? Silence. Then his posture stiffened hard enough that even I felt my stomach tighten. No, he said immediately. That does not make sense. I could hear Claire crying faintly through the phone speaker from where I stood. Ethan turned away slightly, running one hand through his hair while listening. When? He asked quietly. Another pause. Then he looked back at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Fear mixed with disbelief. We are coming now, he said into the phone before ending the call. Ethan? I asked softly. He stared at me for one long second, like he was trying to figure out how to say something impossible. Then he finally spoke. It is my father, he said quietly. There is something you do not know yet. The drive to Northwestern Memorial felt strangely quiet despite the snow and traffic outside. Ethan kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, while downtown Chicago blurred silver and white beyond the windshield. Neither of us spoke for the first 10 minutes. The only sound inside the car was the steady rhythm of windshield wipers cutting through falling snow. Finally, I looked toward him. What happened to your father? Ethan swallowed before answering. Claire said he collapsed during a private investor dinner. His voice sounded distant, controlled too carefully. They think it is stress-related. I stared out at the frozen streets again without speaking. Robert Mercer had spent decades carrying an entire corporation on his back, while pretending pressure did not affect him. Men like him usually believed vulnerability was something other people experienced. There is more, Ethan said quietly after another long silence. I turned toward him slowly. His jaw tightened once before he continued. Apparently he asked for you before they took him upstairs. That surprised me enough that I stopped breathing for half a second. Me? Ethan nodded once. Claire said he kept repeating your name. Snow drifted across Michigan Avenue outside. while ambulance lights reflected faintly against nearby buildings. Something uneasy settled in my chest then. Not fear exactly. More like the feeling of approaching a truth you already sense, but are not fully ready to hear aloud. When we reached the hospital parking structure, reporters were already gathering near the emergency entrance downstairs. Mercer Biotech executives never moved through Chicago quietly anymore after the gala. Ethan parked in silence before turning off the engine. "You do not have to come upstairs," he said softly. I looked at him carefully. "Yes," I answered after a moment. "I think I do." The private cardiac floor smelled faintly like antiseptic and burnt coffee when we stepped off the elevator. Claire stood immediately from one of the waiting room chairs the second she saw us. Her makeup was streaked slightly beneath her eyes like she had been crying hard enough to forget fixing it afterward. Margaret sat near the windows wrapped in a dark wool coat with both hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked smaller somehow. "How is he?" Ethan asked quickly. Claire shook her head. "Stable now. The doctors said exhaustion triggered the episode." Her eyes moved toward me awkwardly after that. "He keeps asking whether Camila came." The waiting room fell quiet again. Somewhere down the hallway, a heart monitor beeped steadily behind closed doors. Margaret finally stood slowly from her chair. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly to me. "No performance, no manipulation, just exhaustion." I nodded once. "Of course." Ethan rubbed his forehead tiredly. "What exactly happened?" Claire glanced toward their mother uncertainly before answering. "Dad was meeting with investors from Boston tonight. Someone brought up the restructuring transition and started asking questions about the gala." Her voice tightened slightly. One of them joked that the Mercer family managed to humiliate the woman who saved their company. Nobody spoke after that, because the cruelty of it sounded worse when strangers repeated it back to us plainly. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. "Your father tried defending the situation," she said quietly. "Then he started having chest pain." Ethan lowered himself into one of the waiting room chairs heavily, staring at the floor. I watched him carefully then. For the first time since I met him, the Mercer name no longer looked like armor on him. It looked heavy. Around 20 minutes later, a doctor stepped into the waiting room, holding a chart against his chest. "Family only," he said gently. Margaret immediately looked toward me before anyone else moved. "She comes too." The doctor hesitated only briefly before nodding. Robert Mercer looked older beneath hospital lighting. Monitors glowed softly beside the bed, while snow drifted outside the dark windows beyond him. His skin appeared pale against the white sheets, but his eyes focused immediately when I stepped into the room behind Ethan and Margaret. "Camila," he said quietly. His voice sounded rough with exhaustion. I moved closer to the bed slowly. "You should be resting." A faint smile touched his face for less than a second. Never been very good at that. Ethan stood near the doorway watching both of us carefully, while Claire lingered silently beside their mother. Robert looked around the room once before speaking again. "There are things Ethan does not know." The atmosphere shifted instantly after that. Ethan straightened slightly. "Dad?" Robert ignored him at first, keeping his eyes on me instead. "I should have told him years ago." My stomach tightened slowly. "Told him what?" Robert exhaled carefully, like even breathing hurt. "About the agreement." Ethan frowned immediately. "What agreement?" Margaret's face changed before anyone answered. Not surprise. Fear. Real fear. "Robert," she said sharply under her breath, "this is not the time." But Robert shook his head weakly against the pillow. "It is exactly the time." Ethan looked between all of us now, confusion rising fast in his expression again. "Can somebody please tell me what is happening?" Robert's eyes drifted toward the windows for a moment before returning to me. 5 years ago," he said quietly, "when Mercer Biotech was collapsing, Camila did not just save this company. The room went completely still. Even the monitor beside his bed seemed suddenly louder." Ethan stared at his father without blinking, while Margaret gripped the edge of her coat tightly enough for her knuckles to pale. And then Robert Mercer finally said the one thing none of us were prepared for. "The truth is," he whispered, "this family has owed her far more than money from the very beginning." Nobody in the hospital room spoke after Robert's words settled into the silence. The heart monitor beside his bed continued its steady rhythm, while snow drifted slowly outside the darkened windows beyond him. Ethan stared at his father like he had stopped understanding the room entirely. "What does that mean?" he asked quietly. Robert closed his eyes briefly before answering. "It means this family survived because of Camila, long before she ever became part of it." Margaret looked down at the floor immediately. Claire folded her arms tightly across herself, like she was physically trying to hold together everything she thought she knew. Ethan shook his head once. No, I know she saved the company financially. Robert looked directly at him then. You still do not understand. His voice sounded tired now, older than I had ever heard it. 5 years ago, when Mercer Biotech collapsed, every lender was preparing to leave. Investors were already drafting exit strategies. The company was weeks from disappearing. Ethan frowned hard, struggling to follow. Robert continued carefully. Camila did not simply provide emergency capital. He glanced toward me briefly before looking back at his son. She negotiated every stabilization agreement herself. She restructured the debt. She protected our manufacturing contracts. She personally stopped the board from dismantling operations. Ethan's face slowly lost color again. Operations? Robert nodded once. Your division. The room stayed completely still after that. I watched Ethan trying to process the timeline in real time. His promotions, his department surviving budget cuts, his leadership path staying intact while the company quietly burned around him years earlier. No, he whispered automatically. That cannot be true. It is. Howard Levin's voice said quietly from the doorway. None of us had even heard him arrive. He stepped inside holding a dark overcoat over one arm, his expression calm but serious. I was there during every negotiation. Ethan turned toward him immediately. You knew? Howard gave a small nod. Everyone on the board knew. Claire looked horrified now. Then why keep it secret? Howard glanced briefly toward Margaret before answering carefully. Because public perception mattered more to the Mercer family than honesty. Margaret flinched like the sentence physically hit her. Ethan looked back toward his mother slowly. Mom? She finally raised her eyes, and for the first time since I met her, there was no social performance left inside them. Just shame. The company was collapsing, she whispered. We were terrified. Investors would panic if they discovered control transferred outside the family. Outside the family? Ethan repeated. Camila was your family. Margaret's face tightened painfully after that, because even she understood how late those words arrived. Robert shifted slightly against the hospital pillows, breathing carefully. We told ourselves the arrangement was temporary at first, he admitted quietly. Then years passed and it became easier to maintain the illusion. Ethan laughed once under his breath, but there was no humor in it. The illusion. He turned toward me then, eyes red with exhaustion. All those years, you sat through family dinners while we treated you like you were lucky to be there. I met his gaze steadily. Yes. His voice cracked slightly. Why did you stay? That question hurt differently now, not defensive anymore, genuine. I looked down briefly at my hands before answering honestly. Because I loved you. The room fell silent again. Even Claire looked away after that. Ethan sat slowly into the chair beside the hospital bed like his legs suddenly could not hold him properly anymore. I do not know how to live with that, he whispered. You do not have to live with it alone, Robert said quietly. Ethan looked up sharply. Dad, stop. No. Robert's voice strengthened slightly for the first time all night. You need to hear this. He looked directly at his son now. Camila spent years protecting people who made her feel invisible because she believed love required shrinking herself. The sentence settled heavily across the room because every person there knew it was true. I felt something painful move through my chest hearing it spoken aloud so plainly. And we allowed it, Robert continued quietly. Every one of us. Margaret wiped quickly beneath one eye before speaking. Camila, I know apologies are meaningless compared to what happened. I looked at her calmly. Some apologies matter, but they do not erase patterns. She nodded slowly like she understood exactly what I meant. Claire finally stepped forward after staying silent most of the conversation. I was awful to you, she admitted softly. The honesty surprised me enough that I looked at her carefully. You were not awful all the time, I answered. Just comfortable. Claire swallowed hard after that because she understood the distinction immediately. Cruelty often grows easiest inside comfort. Ethan leaned forward with both hands clasped together now, staring down at the hospital floor. I keep thinking about the chair outside the ballroom. His voice sounded hollow. I cannot stop replaying it. Neither could I. Some humiliations become permanent architecture inside your memory. I wish I could undo it, he whispered. I believed him. That was the hardest part. But believing someone regrets hurting you does not automatically rebuild trust. I stepped toward the window slowly, looking out across the snowy city lights below the hospital. Chicago looked peaceful from high enough above it. Almost unreal. "I am not interested in revenge," I said quietly without turning around. I never was. Behind me, nobody spoke. But I also cannot return to who I was before all this happened. The room stayed silent long enough that even the machines beside Robert's bed sounded louder again. Ethan finally stood slowly behind me. "What does that mean for us?" I closed my eyes briefly before answering. "It means I need boundaries now." The word hung heavily between us because boundaries were unfamiliar territory inside relationships built around emotional accommodation. I turned back toward him carefully. No more shrinking. No more pretending comments are harmless. No more making myself smaller so other people can feel comfortable. Ethan nodded slowly, pain visible all across his face now. "And if I can change?" I looked at him for a long moment, because part of me still remembered the man I originally fell in love with beneath all the damage. "Then change because you finally understand why it matters," I said softly. "Not because you are afraid of losing me." Tears filled his eyes after that, though he blinked them back immediately. The room felt unbearably human suddenly. No executives, no shareholders, no status. Just people standing inside the wreckage of choices they could no longer take back. Then the nurse entered quietly to check Robert's monitors, breaking the moment apart before any of us fully understood what came next. And standing there beneath the cold hospital lights while snow continued falling outside, I realized something difficult and honest at the same time. The truth had finally been exposed completely, but forgiveness and healing were still nowhere close to finished. Spring arrived slowly that year. Chicago always looked exhausted at the end of winter, like the city itself needed time to believe warmth was coming back. By April, the snow had finally disappeared from the sidewalks around Mercer Biotech headquarters, replaced by soft rain and pale sunlight reflecting off glass towers downtown. Life did not magically become perfect after everything that happened. That is the part stories usually leave out. Healing is quieter than revenge, less dramatic, more honest. Some mornings I still woke up remembering the ballroom, the folding chair beside the catering trays, Ethan's voice telling me not to make things difficult. Certain memories do not disappear simply because the truth eventually comes out. But over time, those memories stopped controlling the shape of my days. That mattered more than I expected. Mercer Biotech stabilized faster than analysts predicted after the restructuring. Investors responded well to transparency. Employees responded even better. The strange thing about leadership is that people can feel when someone no longer leads from ego. I spent most mornings walking the lower executive floors before meetings, stopping to speak with analysts, assistants, operations teams, and interns most executives usually ignored, not because it looked good, because I remembered exactly how invisible people can feel inside powerful institutions. One afternoon, a young woman from the finance department stopped me near the elevators, holding a stack of quarterly reports against her chest. "Miss Reyes," she asked nervously, "can I ask you something?" I smiled softly. "Of course." She hesitated before speaking. How do you know when you are making yourself too small for other people?" The question stayed with me long after she walked away, because the truth is, there is no dramatic moment when it begins happening. You slowly stop correcting disrespect, slowly stop expressing needs, slowly start confusing peacekeeping with love, until one day you wake up sitting outside a ballroom wondering how you disappeared inside your own life. Ethan and I did not get back together. I know some people listening probably expected that ending. Part of me once expected it too. But certain kinds of love cannot survive once self-respect finally wakes up fully. That does not mean I hated him. I did not. In some ways, losing Ethan hurt precisely because I understood he was not evil, just emotionally unexamined, weak in ways society often forgives in men for too long. We spoke occasionally after the hospital, mostly short conversations about the company transition or Robert's health. The sharpness between us softened with time, replaced by something quieter and sadder. Accountability. Ethan eventually stepped down from operations leadership voluntarily, 6 weeks after the restructuring finalized. Not because I forced him to, because for the first time in his life, he understood that titles mean very little if your character cannot support them. The last conversation we had alone happened on a rainy Thursday evening outside the old pharmacy building in San Antonio where my grandfather raised me. Ethan had flown down unexpectedly after Robert began physical rehabilitation. I found him standing beneath the faded pharmacy sign, looking up at the windows above it while warm Texas rain darkened the sidewalk around us. "This is where you learned all of it?" he asked quietly once I walked up beside him. "Most of it." He nodded slowly. "I think I understand now why you never needed our family the way we thought you did." I looked toward the old upstairs apartment windows glowing softly against the storm clouds. "I never needed saving," I answered gently. "I just wanted partnership." Ethan lowered his eyes after that. "I loved you," he said quietly. "I know. I just did not know how to love someone without needing to feel bigger than them." The honesty in that sentence almost broke my heart all over again because it sounded like the truest thing he had ever said to me. We stood there listening to rain hit the sidewalk for a while before he finally smiled faintly. "You know," he said, "my father told me something during rehab." "What?" Ethan looked toward me carefully. "He said the strongest person in the room is usually the one who does not need everyone else to feel small." I felt tears sting lightly behind my eyes then, but this time they did not come from humiliation or grief, just recognition. Growth, the painful kind that changes people permanently. Robert eventually retired fully by summer. Margaret started volunteering quietly with women's business mentorship programs in Chicago after everything happened. Claire surprised everyone most by changing the way she moved through the world completely. A few months ago, she sent me a picture of herself speaking at a leadership conference for young women in finance. The caption simply read, "Trying to do better." Sometimes people really can change once their reflection becomes impossible to avoid. As for me, I kept the folding chair. Not because I enjoy remembering painful things, because it reminds me of who I became after that night. A month after the gala, one of the catering staff from the hotel contacted my office, saying they accidentally discovered the chair had been marked for disposal after the event. I asked them to send it to me instead. It sits now in the corner of my home office, beside the large windows overlooking the lake. Simple black cushion, metal legs slightly scratched near the bottom. Most people who visit probably assume it means nothing. But sometimes late at night, when the city quiets down and the lights reflect softly across the water outside, I look at that chair and remember something important. The worst moment of your life can become the exact place where you finally stop abandoning yourself. If you are listening to this story while sitting in your own version of that chair right now, emotionally or physically, I need you to hear me carefully. Love should never require you to disappear. Real love does not humiliate you to protect someone else's ego. Real partnership leaves room for your full voice, your full ambition, your full humanity. Protect your finances. Protect your peace. Protect your instincts when something inside you keeps whispering that you are becoming smaller in a relationship. God, the universe, whatever you believe in, often sends discomfort long before destruction arrives. Do not ignore it just because you are afraid of being alone. Loneliness heals faster than losing yourself completely. My name is Camila Reyes. I am 34 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is this. The moment you stop shrinking for people is the moment your real life finally begins. Thank you for sitting with me through this story. Truly. I know there are people listening right now carrying silent heartbreak nobody around them fully sees. I hope this reminded you that your worth does not decrease simply because someone failed to recognize it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is quietly walk away from the table where you were never being respected properly in the first place. And if this story stayed with you, leave a comment sharing where you are listening from tonight. Subscribe only if these stories genuinely make you feel a little less alone. There are more stories coming in this playlist about hidden truths, family betrayal, quiet resilience, and the moments people finally choose themselves after years of silence. Some endings are painful, some are healing, but all of them begin the same way, with someone finally deciding they deserve better than the seat they were told to accept.